The ballroom at the Ashwell Country Club was strung with 50 white candles and 4 years of photographs. Me and Griffin Whitlock on a beach in Cabo at the courthouse steps, holding hands under a chuppah of fairy lights. 90 guests. String quartet. A 3-tier cake with "Happy 4th Anniversary" piped in gold. Then Griffin stood up, tapped his champagne glass 3 times, and instead of a toast he dropped a thick manila folder onto the white tablecloth in front of me. "I want a divorce, Vale," he said loud enough for the back tables to hear. "I've had the papers ready for weeks. I just wanted to do it here. In front of everyone. So you understand exactly how done I am." The quartet stopped mid-note. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. I didn't move. I sat there in my champagne-colored dress, hands folded in my lap, staring at that folder like it was a bomb that hadn't gone off yet. And somewhere in the back of the room his mother, Delphine, was already smiling. Freeze there for 1 second. Hold that image with me. The folder, the silence, the smile on his mother's face like she'd been waiting 4 years for this exact moment. Now let me take you back. 72 hours earlier. Because what none of them knew, not Griffin, not his parents, not one single person clapping quietly at table 6, was that 3 days before this party my 81-year-old grandmother Unia had signed away the single largest asset our family owned, and she hadn't signed it over to my marriage. She'd signed it over to me. Only me. While she still had the strength to hold a pen. Before I get into what happens next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe and stick with me. Because in exactly 1 day, the same day this party ends, Griffin's parents are going to walk into a room expecting to celebrate the biggest financial win of their lives. And I'm going to hand them a folder of my own. To understand the folder on that table, you have to understand why Delphine and Warwick Whitlock pushed their son toward me in the first place, because it was never really about love, not from where they sat. I grew up in Millbrook, New York, on land that had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother Unia ran Hollis Grove, a 42-acre vineyard and event estate that hosted weddings, harvest festivals, and corporate retreats, and had quietly become one of the most profitable pieces of land in the county. I spent every summer of my childhood there, picking grapes with dirt under my nails, learning the business from Unia's kitchen table instead of a classroom. I wasn't rich in the way people assumed when they heard vineyard owner's granddaughter. I drove a used Honda and waited tables through college. But I was undeniably the future of something valuable. Griffin was charming in the way people are when they've never had to try very hard. Old money on paper, thinning money in practice. His father Warwick had burned through most of the family's real estate portfolio on bad investments, and his mother Delphine had spent 2 decades keeping up appearances that no longer matched the bank statements. When Griffin brought me home to meet them for the first time, Delphine didn't ask about my hobbies or my values. She asked within the first 10 minutes whether the vineyard was still in the family, and whether I was an only grandchild. I didn't hear the calculation happening behind her eyes. I heard warmth. I heard a mother who wanted to know her son's girlfriend. I was 26, in love for the first time in a way that felt permanent, and I mistook curiosity for care. We married 18 months later at Hollis Grove itself, under the same lights that would later frame my humiliation. Unia walked me down the aisle because my parents had passed when I was young, and she'd raced me the rest of the way. During the reception, Warwick gave a toast about family joining family, and assets multiplying when good people combine forces. A strange thing to say at a wedding if anyone had been paying close enough attention. Nobody was. I certainly wasn't. I was too busy being happy. For the first 2 years my marriage looked from the outside like something worth envying. Griffin was attentive at dinner parties, generous with compliments in front of others, quick to mention my wife's vineyard, like it belonged to both of us equally. He started sitting in on meetings with Unia's estate lawyer, just to understand the business, he said. He started asking me gently whether it wouldn't make more sense to add his name to the deed, for tax purposes, for continuity for the future. Trusting and in love and genuinely believing my husband wanted to build something with me, I brought it up to my grandmother more than once. Unia always said the same thing. "Not yet, sweetheart. Let's see how things settle." I thought she was being overly cautious. I had no idea she was watching something the rest of us couldn't see yet. The first real crack showed up on a Tuesday in March, almost a year before the anniversary party, when I came home early from a dentist appointment and overheard Griffin on the phone in his home office. I wasn't trying to listen. I was hanging my coat by the door when I heard my own name. She still thinks it's mutual, Griffin was saying, laughing quietly. Once the deed transfer clears, it basically doesn't matter what she thinks. I stood frozen in the hallway. I told myself I'd misheard something, that it was about a work project, that my husband of 3 years wasn't talking about me like I was a line item. I didn't confront him that day. I told myself I needed more context first, and some small, self-protective part of me wasn't ready to find out what the context actually was. Over the following months, the pattern kept surfacing in smaller, quieter ways. Griffin stopped attending harvest season at Hollis Grove, claiming work conflicts, but I noticed he still asked detailed questions about revenue and event bookings when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Delphine started calling more frequently, always steering conversations toward the estate's long-term plans, and keeping things simple legally speaking for when Unia passes. Warwick began referring to the vineyard in front of other people as the Whitlock Hollis property, a phrase I had never once used myself. Then Unia got sick. It started as fatigue, then a diagnosis nobody wanted to say out loud: advanced pancreatic cancer, stage 4 months instead of years. I moved into a spare room at the estate to help care for her, splitting my time between hospital visits and running the business she could no longer manage alone. Griffin visited twice in the first month. Delphine visited 5 times, always with paperwork, always gently suggesting that now might be the time to formalize some things for everyone's protection. I was too exhausted, too heartbroken, too busy holding my grandmother's hand through chemo appointments to notice that protection kept meaning the same thing every time it came out of Delphine's mouth. Get Griffin's name on the deed before Unia died and the opportunity closed forever. It was Unia, lying in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and more clarity than anyone gave her credit for, who finally said the thing I'd been too afraid to say myself. "Sweetheart," she said one evening, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "I need you to call my lawyer tomorrow. Just you. Don't tell Griffin." Unia had built Hollis Grove from nothing alongside a husband who died young, and she hadn't survived 4 decades in a competitive, often cutthroat wine and event business by being naive about people. She'd watched Delphine's questions at that very first dinner years ago. She'd watched Warwick's strange wedding toast about assets multiplying. She hadn't said anything at the time because I was happy, and happiness, she always believed, deserved a chance to prove itself before anyone tore it down with suspicion. But she'd also never stopped paying attention. 2 years into my marriage, she'd quietly hired a private investigator. Not out of paranoia, she always insisted, but out of the same instinct that had kept her business alive through 3 recessions. What came back confirmed what she'd suspected. Warwick was 2 years behind on payments for a commercial property in Connecticut. Delphine had taken out a private loan against furniture and jewelry nobody outside the family knew was mortgaged. The Whitlocks weren't old money anymore. They were old debt wearing old money's clothes, and Hollis Grove, worth an estimated $11 million including the land, the winery operation and the event business, was the only thing standing between them and total collapse. She never told me any of this while she was healthy enough to fight it herself, quietly restructuring the estate's ownership documents over 18 months so that no single fast conversation could undo the protection she was building. She met with her lawyer without Griffin present. She had the deed rewritten so that Hollis Grove could only transfer through a specific, deliberate legal process. One that required her direct signature, witnessed and notarized, and couldn't be altered through marital property law, joint filing, or any document Griffin might quietly get me to sign in a moment of exhaustion or grief. And when the diagnosis came and she understood she was running out of time, she accelerated everything. 3 days before the anniversary party, with a hospice nurse in the next room and her lawyer sitting bedside with a stack of papers, my grandmother signed the final transfer. Hollis Grove, the land, the winery, the events business, all $11 million of it, passed entirely and irrevocably into my name alone. No joint ownership. No pending transfer to a married couple. No language a divorce attorney could later argue entitled Griffin to half. "He was never going to marry you for you," she told me that night, her voice thin but her eyes clear. "I wanted to be wrong about that for 4 years. I'm sorry I wasn't." I cried harder that night than I had at any point during her illness, not because of the deed, which I barely understood the significance of yet, but because some quiet, denied part of me had known the truth about my marriage for a long time, and hearing someone else say it out loud made it impossible to keep pretending. 2 days after Unia signed the papers, with her stable but fading and a full-time hospice nurse now living at the estate, I almost cancelled the anniversary party entirely. It was Griffin who insisted we go through with it. "It's important to my parents," he said, which should have been the first warning sign, since it had never once been about what mattered to me. "We've had this planned for months. Let's not make it weird." I agreed, exhausted and grieving and still somehow holding on to a thread of hope that the marriage could be saved, that whatever coldness had crept into our relationship over the past year was fixable, that the version of Griffin who'd once shown up excited for harvest season still existed somewhere underneath the distance. I spent the morning of the party at my grandmother's bedside, whispering that I loved her, promising to come back and tell her everything about the night. She squeezed my hand and said only one thing: "Wear the champagne dress. And veil. Whatever happens tonight, you don't owe anyone an explanation for what's already yours." I didn't fully understand what she meant until hours later. The party itself started exactly the way 90 anniversary parties before it had started. Champagne, string quartet, a slideshow of 4 years of photographs playing on a screen near the cake table. Delphine worked the room like she was hosting it herself, laughing loudly at every table, occasionally catching Warwick's eye across the room in a way that felt, if you were watching closely, less like a proud mother-in-law and more like someone waiting for a signal. I noticed Griffin checking his phone more than usual. I noticed my mother-in-law's laugh had a strange, brittle edge to it, like something rehearsed. I noticed Griffin's best man from the wedding, a lawyer named Everett Bly, standing near the bar the entire night instead of mingling. A man I hadn't seen socially in over a year, suddenly present at my anniversary party with no explanation given. I didn't put it together. Grief and exhaustion have a way of dulling even a sharp person's instincts, and I'd spent the past 3 weeks running on almost no sleep, splitting myself between a dying grandmother and a marriage I could no longer fully recognize. So when Griffin stood up and tapped his glass, I assumed, the way anyone would, that a toast was coming. What came instead was the folder. Griffin's hands didn't shake when he dropped it on the table. His voice didn't waver either, and that steadiness was almost the cruelest part. This wasn't a man losing control in a moment of anger. This was a man who had planned every second of it. "I want a divorce veil," he said again, louder this time, making sure table 6 and table 7 and the DJ booth all heard it clearly. "I've had the papers ready for weeks. I just wanted to do it here. So you understand exactly how done I am, and so everyone else understands it too." 90 guests went silent. My aunt gasped audibly. Somewhere near the bar, Everett Bly, the lawyer, the friend, who'd shown up without explanation, pulled out his own phone and started recording, presumably at Griffin's request, presumably to have a witnessed record for whatever came next. I sat completely still, staring at the folder, my mind refusing to process what was happening in real time. And then I made the mistake of looking past Griffin's shoulder toward his parents' table. Delphine was smiling. Not shocked. Not embarrassed on her son's behalf. Smiling, the specific tight-lipped, satisfied smile of someone watching a plan finally arrive at its intended destination. Warwick had his arm around his wife's shoulders and was nodding slowly, like a man confirming a business deal had closed. That was the moment something in me went very quiet and very still. Not devastated, not yet, but calculating in a way I'd never had to be before. Because in that instant, watching Delphine smile, I understood with total clarity that this humiliation hadn't been Griffin's idea alone. This had been planned, coordinated, timed. The lawyer at the bar. The public setting. The 4 years of small comments about the deed and the vineyard and keeping things simple, legally speaking. It all clicked into a single, ugly shape. They thought they already had the vineyard. They thought this divorce was a formality on the way to collecting an $11 million prize they believed was already half theirs through marital property law. Half of Hollis Grove guaranteed the moment the papers were signed. That was what the smile meant. That was what the lawyer at the bar meant. They weren't watching a marriage end. They were watching an investment mature. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at Griffin, then slowly around the silent room full of frozen faces and said only 4 words. "You'll regret this timing." Then I stood up, smoothed my champagne-colored dress and walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving 90 guests, a stunned quartet and a folder of divorce papers sitting untouched on the white tablecloth. I drove straight from the country club to Hollis Grove, arriving just after 11, still in my heels and my champagne dress, mascara finally breaking loose somewhere on the dark highway between the two places that had defined my entire life. The hospice nurse met me at the door with a look that told me everything before any words were spoken. Unia had passed less than an hour earlier, peacefully in her sleep with the nurse beside her, but alone without me there, because I'd been sitting through a public humiliation orchestrated by the family that had married into my grandmother's legacy specifically to take it. I sat on the porch steps of the house I'd grown up visiting every summer and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Grief for my grandmother tangled together with the rawest kind of betrayal, the two griefs impossible to separate from each other. I didn't call Griffin. I didn't call anyone. I sat alone under the same stars that had watched me get married on this exact property 4 years earlier, and I let myself feel every part of it before I let myself think about what came next. It was nearly 2 in the morning when my phone buzzed. A text from Griffin, oddly casual given the night's events. We should talk tomorrow about splitting things up. My parents think it makes sense to keep this efficient. As if 4 years and my grandmother's final days were a logistics problem. I didn't reply that night. Instead, I went inside, sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where I'd learned the entire vineyard business as a child, and opened the drawer where she kept important documents. There, in a sealed envelope with my name written in her careful handwriting, was a copy of the finalized deed transfer, notarized 3 days earlier, along with a short handwritten letter. Vale, by the time you read this, I may be gone or close to it. I want you to know I didn't do this because I stopped loving Griffin as family. I did this because I never stopped loving you more. Hollis Grove is yours. All of it. No conditions, no shared ownership, nothing anyone can argue their way into. Whatever happens with your marriage, you will never lose what our family built. Use it wisely. Use it kindly. But use it as yours. Grandma J. I read that letter 4 times before the shock fully settled into something else. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but a kind of steadying resolve. My grandmother had seen this coming before I'd been willing to admit it myself. And she'd made sure that no matter how ugly the divorce got, no matter what Delphine and Warwick thought they'd secured through years of careful positioning, there was nothing left for them to take. That was the moment I stopped grieving the marriage and started planning the morning. The next 4 hours I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the deed transfer documents and a legal pad, and I built something of my own. Not out of vengeance exactly, though I wouldn't have argued with anyone who called it that, but out of the same instinct my grandmother had spent 2 years quietly acting on. Get ahead of people who think they've already won. I called Unia's estate attorney Adler Voss at 6 in the morning, earlier than professional courtesy usually allowed, but he picked up on the second ring, already aware of what had happened the night before because Unia had prepared him for exactly this possibility months in advance. She knew this day might come, Adler said gently. She wanted you to have everything ready. It's already drafted, Vale. All you have to do is decide when to use it. What he had waiting was a folder, an intentional mirror of the one Griffin had dropped on the table the night before, except mine contained facts instead of ultimatums. Inside, a certified copy of the finalized, irrevocable deed transfer dated 3 days before the party, proving Hollis Grove had never been marital property to begin with and couldn't be divided in any divorce settlement. A formal letter from Adler's office confirming that any prior verbal or informal understanding about eventual joint ownership held no legal weight, since no such agreement had ever been filed. And perhaps most damaging of all, a printed summary, compiled by the same private investigator my grandmother had hired 2 years earlier, outlining Warwick's defaulted commercial property loan and Delphine's undisclosed private loans against family assets. Evidence that the Whitlocks had married their son into Hollis Grove specifically because they needed the money it represented to survive their own financial collapse. I hadn't planned to use that last piece. It felt, even in my anger, like more than I needed to make my point. But Adler reminded me of something important. Griffin's family hadn't shown me mercy or privacy when they orchestrated a public humiliation in front of 90 guests. They didn't get to expect discretion now. I spent the rest of the morning at Hollis Grove, walking the rows of vines my grandmother had planted decades earlier, calling the small handful of people I trusted. My best friend since college, Frankie, who drove up within the hour without being asked twice, and Unia's longtime estate manager, a steady, quiet man named Silas who'd worked the property for 22 years and looked at me with the kind of loyalty that had nothing to do with money. By noon the folder was complete. And I'd made a decision about exactly where and when to hand it over. Not privately, not quietly, but the same way Griffin had chosen to end our marriage. In front of his family. The Whitlocks had scheduled what they called a transition brunch for the following afternoon at their own house. An event I later learned had been planned even before the divorce papers were served, arranged so Delphine and Warwick could celebrate what they believed was the practical resolution of a marriage that had outlived its financial usefulness. Griffin had texted me an address and time as though nothing unusual had happened, as though showing up to discuss next steps. The day after a public humiliation and my grandmother's death was a reasonable thing to ask of anyone. I went. Not because I owed them anything but because I wanted to watch their faces when the folder landed. I arrived at the Whitlock house in a plain black dress, calm in a way that unsettled the room the moment I walked in. Delphine greeted me with a syrupy, performative warmth. "Vale, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about your grandmother." The kind of condolence that manages to sound like congratulations underneath. Warwick shook my hand a beat too firmly, already talking about keeping the transition smooth and handling the property matters efficiently now that things are settled. Griffin sat at the head of the dining table looking, for the first time since the party, slightly uncertain, as if some part of him had expected me to arrive broken, and my composure was the first thing not going according to plan. I sat down, set my folder on the table exactly the way Griffin had set his, and waited until everyone had a chance to settle into their chairs and their assumptions. "Before we talk about property," I said evenly, "I want to make sure everyone here understands what my grandmother did 3 days before the anniversary party." I opened the folder and slid the notarized deed transfer across the table first. Delphine picked it up, scanning it quickly, her smile faltering somewhere around the second paragraph. Warwick leaned over her shoulder, reading the same lines twice, his face draining of color as the meaning landed. "Hollis Grove, all $11 million of it, transferred irrevocably into my sole name 3 full days before the marriage legally ended. Not shared property. Not something Griffin had any claim to under divorce law. Nothing left to divide, negotiate, or efficiently transition." "This isn't possible," Warwick said quietly. "We had an understanding." "You had an understanding with my husband," I said. "Not with my grandmother. Not with me. And apparently not with the law, since verbal understandings don't override a notarized deed." Griffin said nothing. He sat very still, staring at the document, finally beginning to understand what his parents' plan had actually cost him. I wasn't finished. I slid the second document across the table. Adler's formal letter confirming the deed's legal standing beyond any challenge. And then, after a pause that felt heavier than anything else in the room, the third. The financial summary. Delphine's hands started shaking before she'd even finished the first paragraph. Warwick read his own defaulted loan history laid out in clinical, unforgiving detail. The private financial collapse he'd spent years hiding from country club friends and extended family suddenly sitting in black and white on his own dining table. Read by the daughter-in-law he'd humiliated less than 24 hours earlier. "You married your son to my family's business," I said quietly. "Not because you loved me, though I actually believed for a long time that you did. Because Hollis Grove was worth $11 million and your family needed it to survive. My grandmother figured that out years before I did. And she spent the last 2 years of her life making absolutely sure that no matter what happened to my marriage, you would never see a cent of it." Delphine's composure finally cracked entirely, her voice climbing toward panic. "This changes nothing about the divorce. Griffin is still getting exactly what he asked for at that party," I said, cutting her off, calm and unshaken. "He wanted to be done with me in front of everyone. Consider it done. But he's going to be done with nothing else. No vineyard. No estate. No $11 million to bail out whatever your family's been quietly drowning in. You built an entire marriage as an investment strategy, and my grandmother made sure the investment matured into exactly zero." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Griffin finally looked up from the documents, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I saw something on his face that wasn't performance or charm or calculation. Just the raw, dawning realization of what 4 years of dishonesty had actually cost him. Not just a marriage. Not just his parents' financial rescue plan. The one thing his family had been counting on more than anything else, gone, legally and permanently, because he'd been too impatient and too cruel to wait even a few more days before revealing his hand. I stood up, closed my folder, and looked around the table one last time, at Delphine's shaking hands, at Warwick's ashen face, at Griffin's stunned silence. "You should have waited," I said simply. "My grandmother was faster than all of you." I walked out of the Whitlock house without looking back, got into my car and drove home to Hollis Grove, to the vines my grandmother had planted, to the business that was now entirely, legally, permanently mine, to a future the Whitlocks had spent years quietly trying to steal and had lost in a single afternoon. 6 months later, Hollis Grove hosted its most successful harvest festival in a decade under my full leadership. Silas and Frankie beside me the whole way. A framed photo of Unia on the tasting room wall watching over every bottle poured. I never spoke to the Whitlock family again. I didn't need to. The folder had already said everything that needed saying, and some victories don't require a second act. They just require the truth delivered once at exactly the right moment.